This is the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast, the official podcast of the United States military, coming to you from the center of the military universe, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with your host, Joe Buccino.
Hey folks, Joe Buccino here, host of the 18th Airborne Corps Podcast. This is episode 95, and this is also the second in our series commemorating the Battle of the Bulge. We're releasing this in concert with the 77th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. If you have not listened to our 10-minute or so primer, which we released yesterday, I'd recommend you go back and do that. Battle of the Bulge was waged 16 December 1944 to 25 December 1945. 1 month, 1 week, and 2 days of fighting in Belgium. So our guest today is a really big one, Rick Atkinson. If you don't know who he is, you should. You really should know who that is. Rick Atkinson is a national treasure. He's our greatest storytelling historian. You know the Liberation Trilogy on World War II. The first one, 2002, An Army at Dawn, the War in North Africa, won the Pulitzer for history. The second, which he released 5 years later, was The Day of Battle. That one was Sicily and the Italian campaign. And then again, 5 years later, 2013, he released The Guns at Last Light, which was the remainder of the war in Western Europe, which had Normandy, Market Garden, and what we're talking about today, Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge is covered in the middle portion of that third book. Of course, I recommend any of those books. I guess of those three, the one that I reread portions of most frequently is the third one, The Guns at Last Light. Like all his works, it comes to life, and it brings the war to life. The pages blaze with violence, with love, with humanity, with barbarity. This was a barbaric moment, the Battle of the Bulge. Through his writing, the reader can hear the cries of the afflicted, feel the terror of the young men facing death by violence or death by painful illness. Rick's most recent book, it's not new anymore, it came out 2 years ago, is The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. And this is part of a new trilogy, the Revolution Trilogy, about the American Revolution. That first book is so well done in terms of the research. It's really, frankly, a topic that I didn't know that much about. But it really does, at least for me, it did lay bare the myth of the American Revolution. It's really beautifully packaged, compellingly written, a marvel of research, provides the kind of detail that I think is lost to antiquity in terms of Lexington and Concord, the idea of the militia, the idea of the revolution, the notes taken in the moment. It uses a lot of quotes from letters, diaries, recorded conversations, and Rick really allows the true motivations of that war's combatants to reveal themselves in a way that I really appreciated. So, like the Liberation Trilogy, it's very violent, very detailed, very vivid. And so I say all that because in this conversation, which we've already recorded, we do talk a little bit about the British Are Coming, but we primarily talk about the Battle of the Bulge. And Battle of the Bulge is sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Ardennes Counteroffensive. Of course, the last major German offensive on the Western Front during World War II, and an unsuccessful attempt to push the Allies back from German home territory. So, the American response, the Allied response to this surprise blitzkrieg by the dying German army, the subsequent 6 weeks of fighting, that's what Rick and I talk about here. I was honored to speak with him, and, he lived up to my thoughts, my perception of him, and it was really a wonderful discussion. Here's my talk with Rick Atkinson. As we come on, Rick, the 77th anniversary here of the Battle of the Bulge, it's still such an important moment, I think, in American culture and in our war history. in some ways, almost the entire war, World War II, is encapsulated in that battle. And I think, in some ways, in going through this past weekend, The Guns That Last Light again, war itself, I think, the notion, the philosophy, the stress, the pressure of war is encapsulated in the Battle of the Bulge. So 77 years on, how should we be thinking about it?
Well, it's the biggest battle in American military history, first and foremost. It is a critical pivot point in the war for Europe in World War II, obviously. It was the greatest intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor in World War II. And when there are substantial intelligence failures that causes men to die, and in this case, nearly 20,000 American men died in the Battle of the Bulge. So it's a pretty substantial inflection point in our national history. It tested our alliance, both with the British and the French. It tested our mettle, obviously. It required young men to do things that they weren't certain that they were going to be able to do under the most awful conditions. Winter in the Ardennes is about as bad as it gets in combat. And, we had everything from severe frostbite and trench foot and various other winter afflictions, in addition to having to fight the Germans in what was a real desperation move by Hitler to try to save his war. So, I hope that Americans always remember what happened in December and January of 1944 and 45, both to honor those who fought there, but also to remember that we showed great fortitude as a nation, not just soldiers in foxholes, but as a nation rallying to the cause, doing what needed to be done, pushing supplies at incredible speed into the battle, supporting the troops in every way possible, the 140 million people at home, completely behind the forces that were fighting there. So, I think that when we look back on it now, we're working on 80 years later, we can be proud of it, we can be horrified by it, but we should always remember it.
In terms of, I think, the intelligence failures you pointed to, there were a lot of indicators that were missed. And I think when we think about the initial strike, December 16th, the initial counteroffensive, we hear, I think, in this country, we think about assessment of blame. Your view on this, and I don't want to misrepresent your view in some ways is like, it's war, these things happened. Is that really the way we should think about it? Like, mistakes were made, many men died. Or should we think more deeply about how these signs were missed, why we didn't reinforce the Ardennes, and drill into that component of it?
I think for particularly anybody relying on intelligence or anybody in the intelligence field, there are very relevant lessons to remember from the Ardennes. Now, one of the issues was an over-reliance on Ultra, which was the extraordinary capability of the British to intercept and decode German radio traffic that they believed was basically unassailable. And that capacity through Ultra, which was passed along to senior American commanders, gave the Allied forces the ability to read German mail to an extraordinary degree. We had seen this before in North Africa, where a reliance on Ultra, if you didn't have it on Ultra, then it didn't happen, became the attitude, led to the catastrophe at Kasserine Pass, where the Germans and Italians launched a counteroffensive in February of 1943. They drove the American army back 80 miles. It was the biggest loss of yardage for the American army in World War II. And it cost Eisenhower's senior intelligence officer, who was a Brit, his job. Once again, we had become very reliant on Ultra, believing that if we didn't have it from Ultra, if we didn't have indications through Ultra that the Germans were planning something big, then it wasn't happening. Now, what had happened in North Africa happened again in the planning for the Ardennes offensive by Hitler and his generals. And that was, they didn't go up in the air. They had pretty good radio discipline. They did not broadcast the orders and the instructions that would tip us off to something going on. Even things like take your Panzer battalion and move it forward 30 kilometers. That sort of thing was not being heard because it was not being broadcast. So, go to 9/11 and other, American failures of intelligence. So, for an intelligence officer, for any commander relying on intelligence, I think that the lesson here is be very wary. Be always suspicious. Don't get complacent about what you think you know about the enemy. One other thing I'll say about the Ardennes offensive is there was not a recognition that, in fact, Hitler at this point is driving the train. He is really the supreme Axis commander, field commander. He actually moves toward the battlefield, moves his headquarters. And our presumption is that no sane commander would do something like this. We assume that Rundstedt is running the show because he is the titular commander. And after having been slapped around so thoroughly at Normandy and shoved across France, and they're back on native German soil and they're really hurting, who would do something like this? It's rolling the dice in a irrational way. The phrase that was used by the Germans is "Es geht die Ganze," and that means it's all on one toss of the dice is what it typically means. And so assume that because we wouldn't do that, they wouldn't do that. That's faulty thinking, as it turns out. And again, I think that's a very relevant 21st century lesson from a 20th century battle.
Yeah. And just to think about your analogy there, or your parallel with 9/11, it seems like Ultra was a very easy system to circumvent. As you described, there's a lot of handheld communication or passing of notes or communication that was either encrypted or was face-to-face, more direct. And at this moment, were the Allies just so maybe enchanted with D-Day, with Normandy, with their success? We've got them on the hook. We're driving to end the war by Christmas. Were all these human elements of ego, exhaustion, were they all at play here in this reliance on Ultra?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was an elation through the ranks after the nasty campaign in Normandy. We land on June 6, 1944, and we really go nowhere for 2 months as we try to fight our way through the bocage, and the Germans have us bottled up pretty thoroughly. And then the breakout occurs in late August, and suddenly we're literally racing across France. It really looks like the whole thing is crumbling. Paris is liberated in late August. And there's, natural human elation. There's a sense of, my God, I've survived this. I might live to see the end of the war. I might live to have a regular life after the war. There is I think, a legitimate belief that the Germans are on their heels, that they are running short of everything, including gasoline, which is going to be their Achilles heel, that they're running short of pilots, that they've got the Russians at the back door. Let's not forget that that's the biggest factor in the European theater. The Russians are going to do most of the killing and the dying on behalf of the Allies. So, yeah, there's a tendency, we find when the offensive is launched on December 16th, 1944, there are a lot of guys on vacation. They've taken leave. The commander of the 101st, Maxwell Taylor, is back in Britain briefing units there on what's been happening. The First Army staff, the First Army is going to take the brunt of the battle in the Bulge. Most of them are in Paris or elsewhere on leave. Okay, who can begrudge that after all that they've been through? But there is a feeling that, okay, it's all over but the shouting and the balloons. And, of course, that's going to cause people to let down their guard a bit, to not detect the signs that are, in fact, there, as you say. Even if you don't have Ultra, there's that something was happening, something portentous was happening. So, yes, and again, the human factors coming into play in war is always a fascinating study.
Ultimately, is this really something that the Germans could have done? You pointed to, the shortage of fuel. There's, at this point, the Germans are exhausted as well. They had to punch through the Ardennes and then push, I think, another 50 miles. Did they even have the logistics to do this?
Well, their generals said no. When Hitler concocted this fever dream and presented it to his senior battle staff, there were very few generals, and they were all very experienced at this point, who got up and said, ja, mein Führer, that's a great idea. Yes, they had to get to the Meuse, which was a long haul to start with. They had to cross the Meuse, and the bridges there could be and were blown in the end. And then the objective was to get to Antwerp, to try to both split off the Allied forces that were to the north, to disrupt the Allied port. Antwerp was the most important port in Europe at that point for us, to cause Americans and Britons to lose heart and to try to reverse what was clearly a downward spiral toward defeat.
Mm-hmm.
I think they didn't have the capacity to do it ultimately. Events proved that they didn't have the capacity. Those winter conditions that I described were just as hard on them as they were on us, even harder in the sense that they're on the offensive and they are trying to move forward, and they're short of everything, and not only gasoline, but they're short of ammunition, they're short of airplanes. They will launch a somewhat successful airstrike in the south, but it will cost them 300 pilots, and that is something they cannot afford. So had they reached the Meuse and the Spitze, the point of the spear, got within a few miles of the Meuse, not in force, and if they'd crossed the Meuse, well, that was going to be heartache for sure, and embarrassing among other things. But I don't think that they had the capacity to really make this adventure into a turning point for them. They were going to lose in December 1944. The question was how quickly, how many would die before they lose on both sides, and how many German towns were going to be destroyed as we move toward that final capitulation.
One other element of the story that I think is so compelling in your hands, and I just think in general, is, you have all the big characters that a lot of people, I know I am, is sort of fascinated with or grew enchanted with, I think, after the wars, like Montgomery, Eisenhower, Bradley, Ridgway. Tony McAuliffe comes to light here. Patton joins the battle. Creighton Abrams. So who stands out to you, or what have you learned from some of these figures that you didn't really understand about their character or their leadership in the moments leading up to this?
It's funny you mentioned Anthony McAuliffe, because I was just thinking about him and thinking about as we go through this process of renaming bases, I would like to see something named for Anthony McAuliffe, because he is a real stalwart in the Battle of the Bulge. I think he's an extraordinarily capable figure. I mentioned that the commander of the 101st, Maxwell Taylor, is not around at the time because he's in London. The deputy commander of the division is gone. The chief of staff has blown his brains out with a